Foundations in life are really important for communities and nations and families, churches, and not just for buildings and houses. And a few years ago, I gained a sense of the complexity of foundations in houses. There were a couple of houses in our street that were being knocked down for a rebuild. So after the demolition work had begun and the rubbish was removed and the recycled stuff taken away, the ground was graded and flattened and then allowed to sit and settle for a few weeks. And then they came and marked out where the house would be and brought a bore holing, drilling machine that bored down into the earth. And they kept testing what was coming out, I guess to see whether it was solid rock or soil, something solid for foundations. They drilled 70 of these holes and then they filled them with concrete. And these 70 or so concrete columns formed the foundations for the slab that was laid over the top. Solid foundations for the house. If the foundation below is solid and stable and strong, then the house above will be stable, will be strong, will be able to resist the, the elements and things of life. And likewise, our own lives. When the foundations of our lives are strong and firm, they help sustain us when life becomes chaotic and messy, as it will. When life falls apart, whether it's our national life, our communal life, our family life, or our personal life. And this was a case in ancient Israel. Back in about 2,500 years ago, the southern kingdom of Judah, the northern kingdom of Israel had already been conquered and overrun by the Assyrians. But the southern kingdom was overrun by the Babylonians. Under King Nebuchadnezzar, they came and they broke through the wall, they conquered the armies, they destroyed the city. And they left the majestic temple of Solomon in ruins and ashes, burning. And they led the leading citizens and craftspeople and artisans and so on out of Jerusalem and back across the desert to Babylon as exiles in this foreign land to contribute to the economy and well-being of this empire, this Babylonian empire. And the people themselves were struggling in grief and loss and confusion, a new place, very different, new culture, food, clothing, and all the rest. But also the questions about their own lives and their God. Had God abandoned them? Was God dead? Had God been defeated by the Babylonian gods? If God was still alive, how would God communicate with them? Because God's home on earth, the temple, had been destroyed. These deep questions, and they felt lost. And the various prophets came in and spoke into their lives in different ways, indicating that the people themselves were lost, not just lost in a different place, but they left the covenant they'd made with God. They'd stopped trusting in God and relating to God in the way that God requested. Their leaders were more concerned with wealth and power and might and status and all the other things that came with it. They worshipped those things and put those first. Their land and their life was filled with injustice, where the widows and the orphans and the poor were left and suffered. They no longer trusted or walked with God, but trusted in their own strength and might and the things that they had. It's not much different from a lot of our world today. And the prophets called them back and said, there is only one God, the God of all the heavens and all the earth. There is one God who loves all people and calls this Jewish people then to be a light to the nations, to live in a way of love and justice and hope, to show the world what could be. But they didn't do that. And the prophets called them back into a renewed covenant. And one prophet, Haggai, we read this week, Haggai, there's not much known about Haggai, and his writings 2 or 3 pages. Very simple. He was only a prophet for a short time. Whereas other prophets, when the exile was over, when the Persians conquered the Babylonians and allowed the exiles from Jerusalem to return, particularly under Darius after 70 years, to go and rebuild the city and the area because they could plant crops and contribute to the growing empire of Persia. They went back and the whole place was in ruins still. And they were despairing and grieving and again. And they began the process, the slow process of rebuilding. And they marked out this new temple area, but it was much smaller and far less grand. It would be far less grand than the original Temple of Solomon with its gold and silver and marble and cedar and all the rest of it. The old temple also had these profound symbols of their life, the stone tablets with the law, the Ark of the Covenant and other things, really significant symbols. And Haggai came in, and in the midst of their grief and their complaining and their despair, he reminded them that the glory of the old temple was not in its magnificent structure, not in its gold and its silver and opulence. The glory of the old temple was in the presence of God. The God who filled this temple with life and hope and vitality. The God who was with the people who came and filled them and gave them life and hope. This was the true essence of the old temple. And the symbols in there were important symbols of their life, but they in themselves were nothing powerful. They pointed to the God who had been with them, the God who had led them out of Egypt and formed them as a nation, the God who had led them through the wilderness and into the promised land. This was their God. And the symbols pointed back to that God and reminded the people to trust in God, to build their foundations in this God. And so the various prophets tried to restore the nation and rebuild the nation under God as a renewed covenant. And Haggai helped them to build this new temple, to remind them that the temple was a place where God would be with them in a special way, that God would hold them in their worship and in their prayer and hear them and remind them of what it meant to trust in this God and to walk in the ways of love and justice and mercy and kindness, all the things that God calls them to be in the world. A couple of weeks ago, I read a story about Martin Luther King. I think I've read it before, but I'd forgotten. Early on in the civil rights movement, 1956, during the Montgomery bus boycott, things were stressful. King had been elevated into leadership role, and his time was taken with meetings and strategy and leading these boycotts and this civil rights movement. But it was also filled with threats from outside, threats on his own life, his family, and other leaders. There were crazy people making all sorts of threats. And one night he came home from a late strategy meeting, tired, exhausted, and a bit overwhelmed. And the family were asleep, his wife and daughter were asleep. It was near midnight, and he just paced around his living room, just unwinding when the phone rang. And it was another threat. Get out of Montgomery now and stop this boycott, or you will die. And suddenly he was overwhelmed, perhaps exhausted and overwhelmed and afraid. Afraid not just for him, but for his family and his young daughter. And he sat down at the kitchen table, poured himself a cup of coffee, and tried to work out how he could withdraw from this whole thing without appearing cowardly, without discouraging his own people or giving fuel to the enemies, those who are against them. How he could get out and get back on with his life. And as he sat at the table, he finally just put his head in his hands and he prayed. And he prayed to God and asked how he could get out, what he should do. And the words that came to him in his mind, in his head, were, Martin, persevere. Stand up for justice, for what is right. Keep standing up and proclaiming justice in my name. And I will be with you and I will sustain you. In other words, this work is not yours, it is mine. And I will use your voice and the voices of others. This is not about you and you alone. You will not do it in your own strength, but I will be with you. Don't let go now. And suddenly Martin was filled with peace and hope. The foundations of his work, of his ministry, of his life, of the civil rights movement were again on firm foundations. It wasn't about what he could do, his wisdom, his strength, his eloquence, all the strengths he brought, his own leadership. It was about the people. It was about justice. And it was about the God who called him and called them and led them and fed them and strengthened them and would be with them. And then I went back and read the last speech that is recorded the night before he died in a large church in Memphis, Tennessee. He stood up and addressed this large crowd in the midst of boycotts and strikes that were happening, in the midst of threats and challenges and difficulties. And he recounted some of those challenges and some of the strangeness, the difficulties, his own hardship of being stabbed once and nearly dying and of coming through it. He talked about if God could take him on a celestial journey through time, stopping at all the different significant moments in time and asking him, where would you like to live, Martin? He said he would still like to live now in this time, in the second half of the 20th century. Despite the problems and the challenges and the struggles of life and the world and everything around him, this is when he'd like to live. He was filled with hope. And as he described some of the difficulties and the threats, he said to them in this last paragraph, I have been to the mountaintop and I've looked over and I've seen the promised land, the land of hope, the land of justice, the land of equality and freedom. I've seen it and we're going to get there. We're going to get there together with God holding us and leading us. I may not make it with you. I hope I do. I want to be there. I want to live a long life. But there are some crazy people out there who are making terrible threats. And if I don't, you will still get there because God will be with you. Trust in God. That's the essence of what he was saying. And the next day he was shot and killed. But the movement continued because it wasn't about Martin Luther King. His eloquence, his leadership, his theology, everything he brought was profound and wonderful. But it wasn't about him alone. It was about the people around him, other leaders, and the anonymous thousands and thousands of people that gathered and marched and striked and boycotted and worked and suffered. And in the midst of all of that was this God in whom they trusted. This God they prayed to and cried out to, who led them and guided them. And we're invited to build our foundations in faith in this God, this gracious God who comes to us, who leads us, guides us, and sustains us, and who is ever with us. Even in a world that does not believe in God, God is there in the beauty, in the wonder, in the joy of life, and comes to us in the pain and the struggles and the suffering to hold us in grace and love.